Hello and welcome to Season 14, Episode 12 of the Ubuntu podcast. This week we're going to be talking about technology for kids. We're going to have some command line love and we'll go over your feedback. And joining me this week as ever are Alan.
Hello, hello.
And Martin.
Hello there.
So Alan, what have you been up to recently?
I have been coding in BlitzMax. BlitzMax, yes.
That sounds like a piece of software I got on a PC format cover disk in the early 2000s. What is BlitzMax?
Yes, that sounds about right. So there's this guy called Mark Sibley, I think. He's from New Zealand and he writes programming languages. And over the years, he's written Blitz in various forms on the Commodore Amiga, and then there was Blitz Basic, and then Blitz Plus, and then Blitz Max, and he's moved on to other things. But what he tends to do, or has done with some of these languages, is open source them, and Blitz Max is open source. And it's basically basic, but with lots of extensions so that you can do stuff like OpenGL and audio and sprites, and it's really nice. And I haven't touched it for years. I dig it out every couple of years. I remember it exists and then I do a bit of coding in it and then I forget about it because I'm busy doing other stuff. But I dug it out for a project we won't talk about right now. And it was just interesting to me that there's still a community around it long after it was first super popular. Some of the websites about it have all shut down, but there's an IDE that's built into it called Max IDE, but people prefer to use their own IDEs and development environments. And someone's made an extension for VS Code.
Of course they have.
That does code linting, and another one that lets you compile and run your applications directly from within VS Code. So I can code in VS Code, hit F5, and it compiles and runs the software. It's pretty amazing. I love it.
Excellent.
Yeah, we can't inquire as to what it is and why you're making it, but you're making a thing in this. So it's like supercharged basic.
Yeah, it's mostly used for making video games. And there are some people who still use it and make video games now that are published on Steam, still using it because they've built up a library of tools and, and stuff, and they're cranking out games using it. There's not a huge number, but there are still some. I think Worms 3D was made using Blitz or BlitzMax or something like that. There's a few popular games you might have heard of which are written in it, but less so now. But there's still a few enthusiastic people who use it, and I really like it. There's even a Discord, and I'm in their Discord chatting to people, and they're providing technical support. It's brilliant.
Martin, how about you?
I have made the most powerful Commodore My64 ever.
And how have you been doing that?
So the My64 is a reproduction Commodore 64 case that you can put a mini ITX PC motherboard inside. And I have been able to acquire via those internets a Ryzen 7 4750G APU, which is an 8-core 16-thread CPU with integrated Vega 11 graphics. And I've been able to cram inside this Commodore 64 chassis.
And you've been using this to play games from the 80s?
Yes.
Doing this to emulate a VIC-20.
I have actually, yes. But what's quite good about it is it can play Steam as well. So I've also played Hot Shot Racing on it, for example. But yes, I am working on a boot to Commodore Basic, grub menus and things like that.
Nice.
But one of the fun things was actually modifying heat sinks and fans.
I was wondering about
the
that.
low profile case. If you consider the Commodore 64 bread bin low profile.
It's not low profile at
all. By modern standards it is. So I've been removing fans and putting different aftermarket fans on mismatched components to make this all work, to make it run cool and quiet. And I have got there and I'm very happy with this thing. So next step is to try and upgrade it with even more ridiculous components.
And are you using it with an external GPU as well?
No, because the chassis is so small it can't accommodate a full power supply, so it's using a Pico PSU, so only 150 watts. So I can only use like what's on the motherboard, so no GPUs. Maybe some low-powered PCI devices, but not GPUs.
But having an APU where it's on the same chip is actually a good use case for that.
Yeah, that's a 65 watt part.
Ah, neat. And with that, let's move on. As listeners may know, I have a small child recently acquired into my household, and we bought her a new device recently. So I thought it would be a nice opportunity to do a sort of mini review of that device, but also talk about some of the decisions that we make when we're buying things for our kids and how they might differ from when we buy things for ourselves.
Given that when I was a kid was 40 years ago, yes, they're going to differ.
Right.
Not necessarily when we bought things for ourselves as kids, but when we're making technology purchasing decisions, shall we say.
Right. So what did you buy?
I bought something called a Yoto Player, which is an audio player for kids, designed to be used by kids. So what it is it's a little cube which connects to your Wi-Fi and has a couple of speakers, a nice sort of soft diffused LED matrix display on the front.
It's like 16 by 16 or something. It's not a very high resolution display, is it?
Yeah, so it's like it doesn't display video. It displays like an icon,
right,
or something like that to show what's playing. And the way that you get stuff onto it is you have little NFC cards which you put in a slot. And then that tells it what to play. And it'll either, if it's a radio station or a podcast, it can stream it. Or if it's an audio book, it can download it to the device and then play it offline. And then the way that you tell it what to play once it's downloaded is you swap the cards in and out. I thought this was a really nice idea because when my brother and I were kids, we had little cassette players. And we'd have cassettes with, stories and nursery rhymes and music, and we'd record our own. And, you could have these physical things which you swap in and out. But all of my media these days is on my server. And, I've got various ways of playing it, but there's no physical connection to that media. And I thought this is a really nice way of giving my little girl a way of having a sort of physical connection to the media she's listening to.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about like exchangeable like cartridges effectively. When you look at like Game Boy cartridges, I know it's gaming and it's not media consumption, but a Game Boy cartridge is like child hands, size that you can exchange, and it's very tactile. You pull it out and when you put a different one in that's got a different picture on it, there's a different thing on it. And very much like the Switch, they've got cards in. And I think the Switch cards are about as small as you can go really with small children not eating them. But these are like credit card size things.
Yeah. They're basically a standard NFC card. So if you've got like a badge for work or something, which you use to open the door, it's basically one of those.
Right.
And I was actually really impressed with how intuitive they are, because we had one playing and we gave my little girl another one, and she's 18 months old, and she walked up to it. She pulled out the card that was in there. She stuck in the other one, and she was as happy as anything about it. Huh. So it's, it's a really simple, but a really intuitive system.
I like that. I think that's really elegant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also quite clever because the NFC card sort of gates access to the content as well, right? Yeah,
exactly. So, you can buy ones which you can write yourself, or you can buy them from the store with stuff preloaded on. I have been doing a bit of investigation to work out, because I'm a geek, obviously, I want to know how it works. Like the cards themselves just have a URL on which reads stuff from the Yoto, like points it to the Yoto website. And you can scan it with your phone and just go to the website and play the media in your browser even. But I've not got to writing my own card and seeing how much I can mess with it.
So are you anticipating that maybe you could leverage the media that's on your media server or put files that are compatible with this device on a server you host, so that you could then program it the right URL, put them in, and it plays what you want?
That's what I'm wondering. I mean, you can make your own playlists with your own media and it uploads it to their service, and then you put the card in and it will download to your device. So there's already a means of putting your own media on the device. And this is part of the discussion that I was hoping to lead this into, was if the company goes away for whatever reason, if they go bankrupt, if they get bought out by someone, by a competitor, or by someone who doesn't want to keep this particular service going because they might have a competing service, then there's a risk that it goes away and this media doesn't work anymore. So it got me thinking, how could I ensure longevity for this device? And if I was buying something like this for myself, would I have chosen this one, or do I have stricter rules for myself on what I'm willing to buy, and the confidence levels I need to have in stuff before I would buy it?
So I think it's interesting. I mean, I suspect, yes, you're forward planning for what happens when this company goes away, which probably is after the point at which your offspring care about this thing. It's
Possibly
likely to be in a drawer, and then you dig it out in 5-10 years time, and it no longer works because they've changed something, or their website has moved, or whatever it might be, right? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be surprised if hardwired into the firmware it will only go to their website. And maybe if you did some monkeying with proxies, you could make it go somewhere else. But probably they check the digital certificates and the SSL certs and all that kind of stuff. So it could be a fun adventure to do that kind of thing. But the point about would you buy this thing, I can understand if you were at the far, far end of the Richard Stallman scale, you probably wouldn't, mm-hmm. because it's got firmware in it that you can't look at, right? It's almost certainly not a open free software device. But there was a phrase that used to be used, I think, wife acceptance factor or partner acceptance factor or spousal acceptance factor, whatever you might call it, right, is quite popular when you're buying, when you as a nerd are buying something for the house, which multiple people in the house are going to use. And sure enough, you could hobble something together with a Raspberry Pi and some glue, right? But there's something about this device that's easy, and people could buy presents. They could probably buy more cards for them. Yeah. Or other members of your wider family could come round and would get it straight away and wouldn't have to SSH in and copy files around and, modify the proxy server. And what if she takes it to Nana and Grandpa's house? Mm-hmm. Will it still work over there if it's hooked up to your media server? If you set up a VPN or something, So I think I think it's two separate things. One, yes, it's interesting for you to be able to hack about with this thing. And I would certainly do the same thing. But I think separately, I don't think there's anything wrong with buying these kind of devices. And yeah, I would totally have bought one of these for my kids if it was around because they look cool. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's a bad thing because sometimes you want a thing that just works. And I don't want to teach my kid the fundamental 4 freedoms of GNU at 18 months old when really what they want is to hear a fire engine noise, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would just add to that when my daughter was this age, we weren't keen on introducing things like phones and tablets at that early an age as the way she was able to access, age-appropriate entertainment. We were very resistant to that. So this is great because it's very much a physical thing, much like putting on a CD or a cassette tape would have been, or a VHS tape or something. It's not that, constant attention grabbing, glass slate.
Mm-hmm. So I think there might be a bit of a parallel between something we spoke about with our tablets talk recently. Alan, didn't you say that at least one of your kids has an iPad for school? But
yes.
When you went and bought a tablet, you didn't buy an iPad, you bought an Android tablet.
Yes.
Was that a price point thing, or do you have, like, for your needs, do you make the decisions for the things that you want to buy for you around, is it something you can hack about with, or whereas they need something which they can use for a specific device, or are they also interested in hanging about with them, or do they want that device for another reason?
It's more that I'm empathetic and I don't want to impose my ideals on them. I feel like if they will get more value out of having an iPad, and I know my son would get value over having an iPad because he knows iMovie because he's used it on his school iPad. Mm-hmm. And so transitioning him from having an iPad from school that was slow and ran out of space and, he couldn't do all the visual effects, he couldn't install applications when he's making videos, to his own iPad, which is newer, has more space, and he has the rights to install additional software. And so he can make more compelling content. It's what he was doing, right? That made sense for him. I'm not doing that, and I'm not bought into the Apple world. I've got Android phones. I've always had Android phones. I've got the old iPhone kicking around, but I'm not in that ecosystem. Whereas my daughter has an Apple laptop and an iPhone, and all her friends are on Apple devices, and she FaceTimes and all that kind of stuff. So she's in that ecosystem. So I'm buying what's most appropriate for them. Like I'm not one to say the household has to be a homogenous environment and they all have to have the same things. What's appropriate for one is not appropriate for the other. I mean, I'm the only, well, Sam uses Android. So he's got an Android phone, but he's got an iPad tablet.
Right.
So he has a heterogeneous environment and a PC for playing games. So he's got, he's got all the platforms. I think it's, I don't think I necessarily made a conscious decision, but I certainly do think about the other person. It's not about, well, I could hack on this thing, therefore I'll buy you one. You could potentially hack on this thing, but you won't. Daddy will take it and Daddy will play with it.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing that comes into my mind is support. If I was to buy something for my kid, I would be the one providing technical support. And it does make me nervous to think, if I was to buy them a laptop in the future and it wasn't a Linux laptop and something went wrong with it, what am I going to do?
Why do you care? It's their laptop. They I have not had to touch Sophie's Mac laptop at all. I've wanted to touch it. It's a very nice laptop, but it's not that I haven't been allowed near it. It's that I haven't had to, right? I get the old question. Oh, do you know how to do this thing? Or do you know how to do that thing? But she is 17. Like she has got a decade on your daughter. And Sam has a Windows PC and he's able to debug and diagnose and turn it off and on again or whatever it is he does to make that work. I don't feel I need to impose the Linux usage on the rest of the house. I've tried that in the past and it doesn't work. So yeah, I'm perfectly fine with them having their own stuff because someday they're going to move out and I'm not going to be around and they're not going to go, Dad, can you SSH into my laptop and fix it for me? In exactly that voice.
Yeah. I suppose perhaps my picture of family members and technology has been sort of coloured by it being the other way round, whereas my kids will probably know more about it than I do.
Yeah.
Where, as opposed to me having to support parents and grandparents, it might well be them supporting me in the future.
Yeah, and if you're buying something which is commercially available, not something super niche, but something that's in shops like that thing you've bought for your daughter, I would imagine you can get mainstream support for it, either on websites like Mumsnet or whatever forum you hang out, whether it's a heavy metal forum, where there is a sub forum for people who are parents. This is a mainstream thing, right? But then again, you go on Mumsnet, I guarantee there's a Linux sub, forum in there somewhere. And if you go on the heavy metal forum, there's a Linux thing in there. There's niches within niches within niches in all these places. And I'm sure for a mainstream device, you're going to be able to get support, or your children are going to be able to get support. I don't think it's as big a deal. Oh, they're running Linux, you won't be able to get any support. I don't think that's true. And I don't think it ever was true. I think it was when you buy a piece of equipment, you get support either from the person, who's your nearest expert, or you pay someone else to help you. But that's the same for everything. Like you buy a car. If your dad is a mechanic, then they can help you fix the car. If they're not, then you go and pay a mechanic. Like the expert in the room isn't necessarily you, and it doesn't have to be you. It could be someone else.
Well, I'm interested to know what our listeners think and what approach they take when they're buying stuff for their kids and for their family, and whether they try and instill their own ideals in their technology purchasing decisions. You can get in touch with us at show@ubuntupodcast.org. And now it's time for Command Line Love. And this week, Martin, what did you find for us?
Well, I refound something that I've used on and off over the years, and it's called Gorse.
That's a very satisfying word to say, isn't it?
Yes, Gorse, like sauce, but with a G. And it visualizes version control repositories such as, Git and Subversion and Mercurial.
It doesn't sound as exciting as it is. It is a lot more exciting than you're painting it.
It's a good example of like data is beautiful. You check out, your project or one of your favorite projects and you run Gorse, and there's a whole bunch of options to configure the way it animates and generates these visualizations. And then you pipe that into FFmpeg and you get a beautiful video that shows from the first origins of a project how it was developed and evolved over time. So I've included an example command line in the show notes, which is fairly comprehensive in that it will generate you something very pretty in one line.
If you're currently driving or walking or riding or swimming or whatever you're doing and you can't look at what a video looks like, it's beautiful, like animated blobs flying around the screen, touching blobs. And some of the blobs represent people, and other blobs and lines represent the commits to code or something, right?
So people drift, these avatars drift around representing developers, and they fire green, yellow, and red. Green being new files, red being deletions, and orange being modifications. And you see files appear, being deleted, being changed, and it creates sort of a wibbly wobbly elastic sort of tree-like structure of branches and leaves that represent the project, and it wibbles and wobbles beautifully, and it has bloom effects and all sorts. It's absolutely beautiful. If you've never seen it before, go to gorse.io. They've got a demonstration there. And if you have your own projects, it's really fun to actually run this against your own projects and take a look at, just who's contributed and how over the years.
And now it's time for all your wonderful feedback. Francis Smith emailed us at show@ubuntupodcast.org.
I would prefer no changes to the way Ubuntu does releases. I always run the interim releases up until recently minimal breakage. Never anything major that I couldn't live with. Why mess with it?
Why indeed? Go back and listen to that episode where we talked about this to learn why.
Michael Allen left a comment on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Ubuntu podcast.
I choose to use Ubuntu for my day job, academic data science, and while I can see the interest in rolling release distributions, I depend on Ubuntu being dependable. So it is LTS all the way for my work. I'll take boring stability over exciting instability any day, and 2 years seems just right to me.
John Parr runs Arch Linux, by the way.
As a long-time listener of the Ubuntu podcast, I'm not surprised by the comments made about Arch Linux recently. However, I am surprised by how passionately you have made them. I probably wouldn't have got into Linux without Ubuntu 10.04 working so well on my laptop. It's just that the vast majority of people want something that they can rely on. However, I wanted to learn more, and doing an Arch install about 2 years ago was very educational, and I ended up with a much faster installation. In that 2 years, I've had one update that broke timeshift and a few screen glitches that came and went without intervention, so that's reliable enough for me.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, I suppose from my point of view, maybe I was a little bit more emphatic than I have been in the past because I was guarding my words carefully in recent years, and maybe I don't need to do that so much now. And Arch Linux users are a passionate bunch, and
you should know you used to be one.
Yeah, well, I used to be an Arch Linux developer, by the way.
Craig Parker emailed us.
I wonder if you guys have any advice or experience with automating workstation builds of Ubuntu. Currently, we build all our RHEL 8 workstations via Kickstart files hosted on a local web server. The technician boots the PC from a USB boot disk, enters the address of the Kickstart file, and walks away. The machine builds itself from there in a fully automated fashion. I've been unable to find a workable solution to build Ubuntu workstations in the same manner, however. I have not had any experience of doing that. What about you, Martin?
Yeah, there are a couple of options. In the same email, Craig talked about pre-seeds, which is how, Debian and Ubuntu have traditionally handled that. That's never been particularly well documented, and it can change between releases, and those changes are not necessarily catered for. You can still do pre-seeding, but it is a bit of a faff. What I recommend these days is if you start with an Ubuntu server image, you can then hook into Cloud-init and then do all of the post-boot initial configuration and package seeding that way. And that's a very flexible system. So cloud-init.io, and at the bottom of that page, you'll find a link to a Read the Docs page, which has comprehensive documentation on how to drive Cloud-init.
Yeah, I've used Cloud-init for setting up cloud VMs, as it happens. And yeah, it's a really neat tool. Guile Gwarth commented on our Telegram channel, ubuntupodcast.org/Telegram.
I just listened to the last episode of the podcast, and I have some feedback regarding Microsoft Surface. It basically boils down to Surface plus Linux equals pain. We run an install fest type thing each semester in Zurich, and our experience with Surface devices are not that great. There are models that can be convinced to run Linux, but it often requires out-of-tree kernel patches. Once you get it to boot, you'll very quickly realize that a lot of what makes a Surface a worthwhile productivity experience revolves around the pen and its integration with Office products. Your money is better spent elsewhere if you're looking for a good hybrid device to run Linux on.
Good advice.
Sergio commented on our Telegram channel.
I gave away my Surface Pro 4. My sister now has it with Windows. I got tired of having to rebase the Surface Linux patches on top of the Ubuntu kernel. Community lives on in the Surface Linux subreddit.
And we'll have a link to that in the show notes.
And Dalton Durst also commented on our Telegram channel. It's the place to be.
I'm also similarly fascinated with Surface devices. Unfortunately, the only one that really works, TM, with Linux is the Surface Pro 3, which is getting really long in the tooth. After the Pro 3, they turned off suspend to RAM in the firmware. That means that everything newer needs the kernel, its drivers, and user space to shut it up to sleep. That's not an easy task for most Linux user spaces these days.
So, we're hearing don't buy Surfaces.
Yeah, not good devices if you're a Linux user by the sounds of it. Thank you for the feedback, because they do look like lovely devices, and I have been interested, but I am now fair warned. Thank you.
And that's it for your feedback this week. And that's all for episode 12. Thank you very much for listening. Next week, we will be discussing community news, goings-on, and events. In the meantime, you can email us to show@ubuntupodcast.org. If you would like to help fund our production costs, you can find our Patreon at ubuntupodcast.org/donate. And if you need a VPS for all your VPS needs, you can check out bitfolk.com.